And so there's a distinctive, and we all know there's a great deal of evil and conflict. The subtitle of my talk is, "This is not a world where you can sit down and whimper in." And those were the words of Lucy Stone, famous for her stoning in the marriage vow, keeping her own name and refusing to say that she would obey her husband. So she created a precedent in the middle of the 19th century became somewhat popular. And I suppose that type of independent thrust is what we're looking at. So we have in the world today thousands of what are called NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, engaged in a very distinctive mode of activism, offering all kinds of services around the world. About 50,000, somewhere between 48 and 50,000, are registered with the United Nations. Thousands of others, like the Institute of World Culture, are not registered, but are doing what they think is important. About 3,000 of these NGOs are regularly consulted by the Council on Economic Security at the United Nations. And indeed, when the United Nations put together this program of the Millennium Goals, they invited the NGOs to be part of the effort, not confining it to just governments and their own international organizations. So we receive solicitations all the time: Women for Women International, International Coalition for Women's Health, Save the Children, Doctors Beyond Borders, Amnesty International, FINCA, Direct Relief, the CARE, the mega NGOs. And then there are the smaller ones, like Gene Weideman's foundation here in Santa Barbara that works to bring books and resources to set up libraries in small towns in Africa. There's the group in Scotland that always interests me that trains and sends dogs to sniff for survivors in natural disasters. You all may have your own list of NGOs. There was a news item just Thursday on how CARE has set up and sponsored a project in northern Bangladesh for poor women to become salespersons for basic products like soap and cosmetics and toothpaste. And even though some would be suspicious that Lever Brothers is going to make a lot of money out of this, nonetheless, it is a way of empowering and improving the quality of life for women and their children. These NGOs are privately organized. They're financed organizations that define their own mission and agenda. They fundraise. They establish a board of directors and what they call a management team. They may pay professional staff, but depend on hundreds of volunteers to serve their mission. They enter a country by permission of the government, perhaps to cope with a disaster, but increasingly you find them establishing long-term methods of providing services, helping with development projects, improving the quality of agriculture. And again, there are thousands of such efforts, large and small. They're seen as necessary because many countries do not have the infrastructure to provide services, particularly in rural areas. And they're even accepted by multinational corporations that used to be rather suspicious of them as being somehow kind of radical, but their services actually make it more possible for the multinationals to pursue their goals. There's a recognition that these NGOs bring a creative initiative to their projects. They're freer from bureaucratic politics and corruption, and they involve thousands of citizens and donors from around the world in this massive effort to reduce poverty and improve health and education. This is not completely new. It was long ago, in about 1850, that the Presbyterian Mission brought the first printing press to Beirut, and that actually led to the one of the first Arab nationalist movements. I remember when traveling in the Middle East, encountering an Englishman who had lived there for years, was planting orange trees in Jordan. So volunteers have been at work. They are now given a name, and it's called civil society. And their work is regularly included in the analysis of global needs and development, and that women are the focus of many of these NGO programs: education, health, child care, economic independence, and to get them out of poverty, reduce abuse, and of course, more recently, they're coping with the effects of violence in the Congo. One of my favorites, Women for Women International, which was founded by a native of Iraq who actually spoke here about 5 years ago, Zainab Salbi. She put together this organization definitely to help women, and you can go on the site and you can try to connect with specific women. It's all very well organized, but more recently she's put a lot of attention to the Congo and such places where rape and is become such an awful instrument of war. So this is a very exciting reality and brings a great deal of hope, and is an alternative to the reliance on development projects focused through aid to governments and being siphoned off and ending up in bank accounts in Switzerland. So I thought about these organizations, and I realized that there was a connection with the use of volunteer associations in 19th century America. So I'd like today to build a bridge and see what went into building that bridge, whereby the efforts of women in the 19th century, because we do focus on in the Founding Day Address on some way in which American history shows some connection to global development. And I don't by any means want to claim that it was only American women who built this bridge to global citizenship. Certainly our brothers and sisters in England and other countries of Europe were part of this process, and we should, but that's another time for a talk. So I want first, and I'll try to be somewhat efficient, so to speak, to give some sense of the context, the causes of how American women became so involved in reform activity and the resistance to it, but also the accomplishments, and how it gradually increased its scope so that by the 20th century, one of the founders of a creative reform tool, Jane Addams, was totally involved in internationalism and war and peace. So let me go through this, and I hope you find it interesting. If we just begin with the American Revolution, of 1776 to 1781, historians look at it and say, well, it wasn't much of a war. Neither side really won it decisively. Britain, basically because of dissent in Parliament and the costs, kind of gave up the fight. But they were also being challenged by the French assistance. But Americans won the war of ideas. About that, there's no doubt. They proclaimed and implemented a constellation of ideas that are now labeled as the Republican ideology, not anything to do with the Republican Party, which came much later. It's a word. They had to find something to name their new system of government. They thoroughly rejected monarchy, helped by Tom Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense, and they wanted to make the point that Theirs was to be a political system based upon political theory, what they called self-evident truths, and that it was really going to be different. So a republic became their designation, and if you break it down in terms of its etymology, res publica is a system that does the public business. They are very much against the private interests of the King of England and his involvement in making money off the colonies. So a republic became the magic word, and it's a very open-ended term. Now, women had participated in the war. They'd been affected by the war. They'd raised money for it. They'd risked their lives. They participated in boycotts, gave up their tea for coffee. And so you can see that at least they were aware, but most important for women during the revolution is they listened to the political language, the ideas that their men were expressing around the dinner table or wherever. And so they were hearing a new language of rights, of self-government, of representation, and they gained expectations of change. That somehow, if through the revolution and the establishment of a republic, they were going to have new opportunities and freedom from the restraints of the old common law traditions that affected their life. Abigail Adams is well known for writing her husband, who was at the Second Continental Congress, and asked him famously to remember the ladies in your new codes of law. His response was neither noble nor principled. He expects shock and even derision that a new and larger tribe than the Indians and blacks were seeking a place of rights and privileges. He reminded her that women had the most powerful of weapons, pillow talk, and if they were granted legal and political rights, men would be left completely powerless. What Abigail Adams was seeking was not the right to vote, but a change in the traditional legal status of women, which was called femme couverte. And it was a system that denied married women of any independent legal rights. Whatever rights she had was covered by her husband. So she could not sign contracts. She could never get custody of the children. Anything that she earned by selling her honey or bread was really her husband's money. She could not inherit property unless a man made a specific will that designated that to her. Single women and widows did have some rights, but this was their basic status, as it was for women in Europe, and it was very tightly enforced. The founding leaders did make one concession at the Constitutional Convention, that women would be included as citizens. And they saw this as a civil status. They thought it was just too dangerous to leave half the population out of the jurisdiction of the law. So they were going to be citizens. They could petition a court as well as be punished by a court, but no political rights were given them, such as voting. And interesting enough, though, there was one right that they would gain. 12 of the 13 new states did pass laws permitting divorce, because divorce was seen as necessary to prevent the taxpayers from having to support a woman whose husband was rather useless in providing, or had abandoned her, gone west or whatever. So there was, that was one legal right they did gain. But ideas, as we know, have subtler and perhaps more important ways of influencing history and social situations. And so the ideas of a republic which again focus at first upon representative government elections and all those kinds of things. But the ideas of a republic had a deeper and very important influence on changing, you might say, family relations. And as we go through this, I would want you to think about all those women around the world that don't have much legal protection at this point. We hear about honor killings and all kinds of things like that. And what the American women began to gain at this time might actually throw some light on the building up of a new basis of social relationships. Family relationships, surprisingly, were redefined by the Republican ideology. And we don't often think of, quote, political ideas affecting family relations, but that's what happened. The deduction was made, hey, we kicked out the king, the tyrant, well then we can't let dad retain his authority as a supreme head, a supreme authority. We need to kind of revise his position. And so the idea developed that marriage should be a partnership, and that there should be dialogue and discourse between husband and wife, just like there was in the representative assembly. This was called companionate marriage, and that so the wife should have a share in the decision making. And this idea was extended to parenting. Well, we kicked out the king. Parents shouldn't be allowed to act as a kind of supreme authority, commanding children to obey or giving them punishment. Children should be talked to so that moral reasoning developed. Children should be consulted. They should be encouraged to express their viewpoint. Now, you may think that this is where the country started going to hell in a handbasket, but this was the idea, because children must grow up to be effective citizens who will participate in a new system of representative government. And so the parenting should have that as an aim. The development of active thinking, speaking citizens. Thirdly, daughters should become active agents in the attracting and choosing of suitors, and that courtship should be encouraged, as it was, and that a positive consent by a young woman was necessary. Under Puritan theology, and actually Protestant thinking generally, a young woman should have a right of refusal. But this was changing and saying, no, a young woman, she should be out there. It actually put a burden of competition, so to speak, to bake the best cake or sing the best song in order to attract the proposal, but that she should be a daughter of liberty, is a daughter that should be at liberty to engage freely in courtship. These were fertile seeds for psychological and social change that now in the 21st century are hot issues in other societies where such ideas have yet to take root. Another indirect deduction from the ideology of the revolution was the recognition that if boys were to grow up to become loyal citizens of this new republic, committed to its ideals and principles, their mothers must inculcate in them civic virtues, lest they become spoiled and self-indulgent. There was a real worry that women had a tendency to spoil their sons, and they would grow up to be little brats and selfish in their social behavior. So they needed to be taught very firmly to be tolerant, to be honest, to be generous, to seek the public good, not the private advantage. And that duty came to be called Republican motherhood, a term I just don't think we would be using today. But if mothers were going to be able to serve as Republican mothers, and this was the one, you might say, important responsibility during this period that was assigned to women. You're not going to vote. You're not going to run for office, but you're not to speak out on public matters. But it is very important that you raise particularly young men to be effective, representative Republicans in the ideological sense. But to do this, mothers needed first to be educated. And here is the beginning of the camel's nose going into the tent. The daughters needed, young women needed to be educated. They'd actually been offered education way back in 1636 by the Puritans in the early common schools. Little girls were to go, mostly so they would be able to read the Bible and other such instructional material. Benjamin Franklin, at mid-18th century, he actually put out a proposal for the education of girls. He, incidentally, was one of our first champions of private volunteer associations, the first volunteer fire department, a philosophical society, various school projects, one of which led to the University of Pennsylvania. He was a great champion of this kind of institution, and he wanted to include women. His proposal was not directly taken up, but in the early 1780s, Benjamin Rush, a much neglected founding brother, proposed the creation of a Young Ladies Academy in Philadelphia. And it was organized. It was to have a liberal arts curriculum. It was what we might call a private high school, and very soon replicated in many cities of the North, New York, Boston, Providence, places like that. They thought that it was too much to have girls study astronomy and physics, but certainly history, biology, mathematics, penmanship. There's an essay he wrote that's quite famous, Thoughts on Female Education. It was certainly a breakthrough. And it would be imitated. It was challenged by the very first valedictorian. Priscilla Mason said, we want to be able to study everything that the boys study. And it was somewhat challenged by one of the first, the first woman to actually write an essay on the equality of the sexes, Judith Sargent Murray, who went through a very interesting analysis of how both boys and girls are capable of learning. If there's a appearance of that not being true, it's only because about age 10, when boys go off to prep school and tutors and things like that, girls get left behind. But biologically, she was, and psychologically, she was very convinced of the equality of the sexes, so she was a little disappointed. But by the early 19th century, there were many schools, and many of them set up, very notably by Emma Willard, by women. And pushing towards colleges, Mount Holyoke, I didn't know this at the time I was there, became the first to be more like a college. They called them a seminary. The curriculum was always a source of debate. But the reality, by 1840, thousands of young women in the new United States had received what we would call a liberal arts high school education. And even the daughters of farmers were offered scholarships by institutions like Mount Holyoke. Again, they were privately funded. Usually you tried to find a patron, a wealthy man or so, and they were set up in the same framework emerging at that time of a corporation. And this is also kind of an interesting part of the background, is that the process, in fact, the Institute technically under California law is what's called a public benefit corporation. And I had a member, or corporation, but a corporation, which is a legal framework, you incorporate, fairly simple process, became the tool for organizing colleges, businesses, social service agencies. Actually, Harvard College evidently was the first corporation in American history. So it was also thought that maybe educated women would make better teachers, engaged in missionary work out west or overseas by mid-19th century. There were missions being sent around the world. So that was part of the justification too. And of course, as this happens, you have all these young women who are empowered and enthusiastic about this opportunity. So they become, proponents, expressing a satisfaction, obviously, with this opportunity and eager to make use of it. Another source of change and opportunity in women's lives during this early antebellum period were religious movements, and particularly what's called the Second Great Awakening. It's a very complicated movement. It involved different activities and different priorities from different denominations. What the Congregationalists in Boston wanted was different than the Baptists in Ohio Valley, what the Presbyterians wanted. So we won't attend how the Transcendentalists emerged. We won't go into all of that, but they did offer and reinforce a message of social mission and changed the interpretation of what it meant to be a Christian. To be a good Christian meant to develop your moral character and to prepare, and also with that preparation, experience here and now some sort of spiritual, what's often called born-again experience. This is different than simply focusing on the task of earning your way to heaven. Life is full of suffering, but if you're a good Christian, you'll get your reward after death and a passage to heaven or some such reward. And secondly, under the Augustinian tradition, the social view of a Christian is that the world's a place filled with evil. And only a few will be able to kind of gather in and protect themselves from that evil. So make the best of it, because again, and just try to earn your way to heaven. Well, under the Second Great Awakening, and maybe this is a strong-seated characteristic in the American psyche, is that no, here and now we can improve our society. We can make it even perfect. We can, and so if we all work on improving ourselves, and if we all work on helping others, particularly those who might have a weakness like alcoholism or gambling or petty theft or something, we can morally improve American society. Now, we all know that this can lead to a great deal of righteousness and sense of American exceptionalism, etc., but it was a powerful message. And for all through the 19th century, this sense of a religious mission of moral improvement had a very strong influence. And it helped transform the perception of women from sinners to naturally and more consistently being more moral than men. This is a direct inverse message. In the early days of the Puritans, of course, women were seen to be almost hopelessly embedded in sin, very vulnerable to the influence of Satan, and that's why they needed to be subjected to the authority of men, because if they weren't, all hell would break loose. But by the 19th century, for interesting reasons, it was reversed, and women were seen as most naturally moral, and poor men, the descriptions become very colorful, couldn't help themselves. They were impelled to do bad things. They were, images of them being almost beasts became very common. So, and this was reinforced by the recognition that as men went out to work in the new industrial economy and the commercial world, they would be tempted So after work, they were tempted to go to the bar. If they stayed too long in the bar, they would be tempted to go to the brothel. And so the task of women was to make sure that the men in their life did not sink into such sin. They also had to relinquish their position as head of the household, and so women took over the daily supervision of the household, of children, of servants, and they also began to make the consumer purchases. And so the home, which was often communicated with capital letters, the home became the center of what was called women's sphere, and its decoration, its decorum was all dependent upon a woman's commitment and skills. And it would become a place of peace and moral regeneration for the men when they came home, including, adult sons and things like that. And so there arises what's called a gender differentiation of social space. The woman's space was in the home, and she was to limit her activities in public space, as it's called, except for church activities. Now, this doctrine of the woman's sphere was reinforced by what historians call a domestic ideology. And the paradox is here the American revolutionary ideology has been giving messages of liberty and opportunity and self-reliance, but some, and mostly ministers, were very worried about the pace of social change. So they enlisted some very women, usually through church auxiliaries, to kind of accept another message. And that, again, is this message of woman's sphere. Another name for it is called the cult of true womanhood. And sermons, magazines, novels, as well as the laws, reinforce this idea that a woman's place was in the home, and she was not to be active in public space except in church. They use this ideology to describe moral character, dress, social behavior, her influence over her husband. That was her, in a sense, her positive side of the bargain, that she would be an instrument of moral influence in the home. Virtues such as piety, purity, submission, domesticity were seen as the core virtues to be cultivated. There was a long list of don'ts, reinforced by dire stories of women who had violated them, and public shame would soon come upon any woman who violated the norms of this ideology. And most importantly, a woman's job was sacrificial service. Never should she pursue something for her own interest or her desire. One, and now we begin to look at a few specific pioneers. One source of the expression of the ideology, a woman named Sarah Hale, who was widowed at 29 and left with 5 children. And so this was a necessity that she find some kind of work. She sold hats for a while, but she wanted to write. And her writing drew the attention of some men in Boston who hired her to edit a ladies' magazine. And this became one of the most prominent sources. And now we might mention that magazines and newsletters and all of that are really replacing Scripture as a direct source of social instruction. She called herself an editress, and later she was bought out by a man from Philadelphia, Sam Godey, and for 40 years she edited that ladies' magazine, retiring just before her 90th birthday. She's actually the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, which just before she died, Thomas Edison recited that into his new phonograph, and so the first recorded message in world history was Mary Had a Little Lamb by Sarah Hale. So she was a consistent voice for 3/4 of a century on the development of women's roles. It was a mixed message, and if you haven't heard of her, it's because some feminists, just do not accept her mixed message, and she gets buried. She can retain the conservative belief in women's secret, silent influence, but stressed and worked for education. She kept sending the message that she didn't get it. She wanted women to get an education, including physical education. She had and this was in all of her writing, she helped found a number of schools, and she helped found Vassar College much later in the century. And she certainly encouraged other women to write. She published many first-time authors in her magazine. She also encouraged them to prepare to enter the workforce, because she was not opposed to that, but she was not in any way supportive of women trying to revise their legal rights or get the right to vote. So she was certainly a voice for the cult of true womanhood and the doctrine of sphere. However, as women began to move out a little bit and become aware of what was happening to a more urban society, there was the recognition that not all was right with society. There was a concern, and some of this was generated within religious groups, for the deprived, and a deep concern for the depravity arising in urban environments. Alcohol, gambling, prostitution. It didn't help that mitigate that perception when the Irish immigrated in the 40s and were more prone to an urban lifestyle that was not in conformity with everyone's standards. They recognized that there were elderly, there were widows, there were orphans, there were abused children, there were mentally ill, there were abandoned families, there were prostitutes, and they took this whole group and said they're victims. And they're victims, what's the cause? The selfish immorality of men, the failure of self-restraint. So they applied, you might say, the new ideology to these emerging social problems. New York City, for instance, went from about 5,000 people to 50,000 people in just a few decades. So the question is what to do. And here we get to the task of what was it that women could do to repress the bad things in American society and encourage new things. The tradition for women's activities was charity. Raise money, cake sales, whatever, to give gift baskets to the poor, sew and knit mittens and sweaters. And a lot of this was done in the ladies' auxiliaries in church. And so it was okay to leave your home and go on Tuesday morning to your ladies' auxiliary and talk about what needs to be done and make things that then could be brought to the poor. Now, the first charity organized by Women for Women was really a society for the relief of poor widows in New York City, actually in 1799. The main object was to give good messages. No cash, no employment, but some food, coal, clothing would be appropriate. But in addition to in order to implement this charity, they hit upon an old idea in colonial history, visiting. Even in the earliest days, it was acceptable for a woman to leave her home to go visiting her neighbor. Maybe the neighbor just had a baby. Later visiting her daughter, maybe in another city. So and this was a horizontal relationship to develop friendship and to provide for charity. It was a way of crossing class boundaries. It was a learning experience. You take the basket of food that you have put together and you take it down to the poor section of town and you knock on the door and you go visiting the poor family or the elderly widow or whoever it is you're trying to help. And this, again, was educational. One place they started to visit were local prisons. The women that they heard, there were women there, and indeed there were women in these prisons who were very poorly treated. They had to sleep in the hallways to be separate from the men. And one pioneer, Dorothy Dix, you might have heard of her, discovered that many of the women in jail were actually suffering from some kind of mental illness. Well, why are they in jail if they have this disability? And she launched really a 30-year effort to get the state of Massachusetts to set up a new kind of institution, what was called an asylum for the mentally ill. And of course, these asylums became, in time, very established. The latest one to be closed down in Camarillo, but now has become a university. So she was a pioneer in that way. She just relentlessly lobbied to get these women. And also, she found that some were fallen women, prostitutes. They needed a home where they could learn new skills and change their occupation. Also in this, another response was to set up Sunday schools, give away Bibles, but a more ambitious type of project was led by Sarah Hale, organizing the Seamen's Aid Society. And in 1833, they opened up a home for needy women, raised the funds and all of that for the families of sailors who had died or disappeared at sea. Later, there are reform schools. Now, in all of these cases, women are moving into public space and doing things that don't seem to be that ladylike, but they're doing it on condition that doesn't interfere with their domestic duties, they behave appropriately, and that it's a religious and moral mission. The most, you might say, dramatic of these reform efforts, or really, what we should say, the charity seemed to be not enough. And so the idea was gradually strengthened. We need to change things in society. And in that, there arose the moral reform movement, which might be a subject of laughter, but by 1840, there were 400 female moral reform societies crossing race and class, and their three villains was alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. And they became very committed to having those banned, outlawed, and the way they bolstered their case, we would say engaged in politics, is they would do things like go down and late at night, stand outside the brothel, write down the names of the men who were coming out, which might be the mayor, the banker, and then the next morning go down and have those names published in the newspaper, shaming the men. Okay, for about 10 years, and they were encouraged in this by the ministers. For about 10 years, this was a very active cause, and it obviously raised questions about, well, is this very ladylike? I mean, should our nice moral women actually be in contact with prostitutes and such things? A similar kind of campaign came out of the temperance societies. By mid-19th century, there were locally based 265 Daughters of Temperance societies, and this would have a long life, as we'll see, working to get restrictions on the production and sale of alcohol. There were some activities that were directed towards helping all women, mother societies in which education was offered about infant care and things like that, and health matters. There were health reform societies. Mary Gore Nichols, who was very dedicated about water cure, began to encourage women to improve their health by some new methods. And so women were finding ways to be part of some sort of organizational effort. And the question we might then review is, what was characteristic of what are now called volunteer associations? The charities were called benevolent associations. But as they started to organize, to change things, to reform things, they needed a different name, and so the name that arose was volunteer associations. Why were they so prolific? Why were they so successful? And this is really the core idea that I want to share with you. Because we still have them. I mean, last night's news, there was a group in Santa Maria that every year sells fireworks in order to give to preschools. And they seemed like just a pretty ordinary bunch, but that's their volunteer association. And we know that there's hundreds of them, and certainly thousands just in the state of California. So what was so distinctive and characteristic, and ultimately a contribution to global activism? First of all, local initiative. They were easy to organize. Just there in these particularly small towns, so we could get together, meet, and begin to decide what it is we're going to do. They were very responsive to perceived needs. You know, there was something that had moved them, too much drunkenness or homelessness, or children had died because of lack of food, or maybe it was some kind of book they read or newspaper article. So they could mobilize local feelings right at the moment and get support that we've got to do something. They always wanted to define their own agenda. And so they're very flexible, and then in time they can adapt their agenda. We actually just found a website for something called the 19th Century Reform Association of New York, and they gave their whole history, and you could see how they had to change their agenda as the decades rolled on, and they're still in existence and sound quite contemporary. So that's a very important point, and when we get to national organizations, they want to allow the local groups to define their own agenda. They have local leadership. So the already active women and the already men who are willing to donate, and it's all identified, and so you don't have to go very far, because of course transportation is not what it is today. They could use local churches and town halls at no cost, and generally, again, these associations at the local level were very inexpensive. They often had the support of clergy, who had lost actually their authority in the new America of a busy, bustling, expanding economy. Compared to the 17th century, the clergy were rather threatened. So if they became part of these volunteer associations, it was a way of having some kind of influence and to manage the social change that was sweeping the country. They could do local fundraising. Not for the first time, but they could get funds from the people they knew, knock on the doors of businessmen, hold events in the city hall and get donations at the door. They mastered communication skills, word of mouth, letters, public notices. I mean, the one thing about these women who often were helping organizations that men had put together, but to learn the skills, they didn't have a full-time job. They could get out there in the mornings and do something for their club, their organization. They mastered publicity. One thing, they didn't have money to put an ad. They were famously would write letters to the editor. They'd take some story and then they kind of exaggerate it and kind of use it as a way to get their own message in by writing a letter to the editor. They had newsletters, magazines. It was very popular to write stories of poverty, extreme cases, kind of like the journalism today. They welcomed opposition. If some group or some men came to, say, what are you doing, and all this, they welcomed that because that gave them more publicity. They drew upon the lecture circuit that was popular at the time. We all know that Ralph Waldo Emerson, when he left the church, he earned his living by going around and lecturing, and it was a very extensive lecture circuit, and so they would get one of them, and then they'd have to raise the money to pay the speaker, but again, in the church, in the town hall, and that would give excitement. Remember, there's no TV, there's nothing to do in the evening, so having a lecture at the town hall was attractive. They learned skills of managing an organization, of providing the publicity and all that we've talked about. And then two things that we are probably lacking in many places in the world today. Incorporation of their association was very easy. This is a big topic that American legislators by the 1830s had made incorporation of business very simple. Originally, you had to get the permission of the king, then you had to get the permission of the legislature, and then it was reduced to just an administrative process, such as organizations like ours fill out the documents and send it off to Sacramento. And so they used this business model that made it, again, easy to incorporate. The typical tactic was to get a group of men, a lawyer, a banker, a wealthy donor, a preacher, and maybe there'd be a woman or two on the board of directors, and then they would have the skills to get the organization in place. Their towns were peaceably organized with stable government. We can't imagine this kind of movement taking place in places like Iraq today. But most important, first and foremost, you might say, to the success of these volunteer associations were the constitutional protections of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of peaceable assembly, freedom to petition your government. And we just, you could not emphasize too much those protections, which didn't come at this time from the federal Constitution. They came from the state constitutions because they had their bills of rights. And to this day, I mean, if you want to organize a group, you can just have them over to your house. One of the best stories, I think, is the woman who was suffering from the death of her 3-year-old daughter. Candy Leitner was killed by a drunk driver, and her grief led her to kind of put out a call for anybody else go through this, and a group gathered in her living room. And right there, down there, I think in Pasadena or someplace like that, they organized Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, who I just saw was doing something this weekend. And it started local, then they incorporated in California, and then there emerged a national association with lots of chapters. Now, ultimately, it went through a bad cycle, but it was extremely effective. It became major influence in changing laws regarding drunk driving and increasing the penalties and things like that. Well, that's the method that's protected by these constitutional-based freedoms. And so that, sometimes we kind of forget that. So all this activity was pushing the boundaries of the women's sphere, but it was justified as morally necessary and compatible with the domestic ideology. And there was a multiplier effect. More and more of these organizations directed with more and more of these missions to improve the moral quality of American life, and to guard against the intrusion of evil into society. De Tocqueville defined these volunteer associations as private initiatives for public good focusing on the quality of life. And when he took his tour of America in the 1840s, that's one of the things that he noticed. Americans are just joining. And of course, the mega volunteer association of mid-19th century America was the abolitionist movement. It was given some formal direction by the organization of the Anti-Slavery Association by William Garrison, but there were women who became very involved and became voices in this. They initially were like Lucretia Mott. They went to the formation of this new association. Never occurred to them that they weren't allowed to sign up and join, so they ended up organizing female anti-slavery societies. One of the most active was in Boston. They were helped by the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, which you may have heard of. They were the daughters of a plantation owner, began to challenge the rightness of slavery in their Presbyterian church and were not welcome. They eventually left the South and went to Philadelphia and became active in an anti-slavery movement. It was decided that Sarah would go on a lecture tour in New England. And this was breaking the norm of a woman speaking in public to mixed audiences. This was a no-no, according to the domestic ideology. But she went on this tour anyway, which was very successful, brought out the audiences, brought out the donations, and she and her sister Angelique kept up this activity until finally it did become a bit dangerous, and Angelina married an abolitionist, and they went into other causes. But Sarah's tour brought a scathing letter of criticism from some clergymen in Massachusetts, who said that when a woman assumes the place and tone of man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural. We especially deplore the intimate acquaintance and promiscuous conversation of females of things which ought not to be named. Sarah Grimke was the one who exposed the extent that she had observed of the sexual degradation of slaves by white men. And so it wasn't just, this is an evil. And then ultimately, through Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, this moral argument became one of the most intense pressures towards the abolition, towards the actual effort to abolish slavery. Free soiling was the other. So Sarah wrote back. And she wrote a very famous essay called The Quality of the Sexes, in which she claimed, among other things, that men and women were created equal, capital letters. And it was not man's place for God's to assign woman's sphere. That men had no authority to define a woman's place in society. This was, again, beginning, and this was in 1836, beginning to attack the cult of true womanhood. In 1831, Maria Stuart, a black domestic servant, became the first American woman to criticize slavery publicly before mixed audiences. And of course, later, Sojourner Truth spoke out in her campaign in giving more of a real picture of fascinating white middle-class audiences. The phrase, the abolitionist movement was associated with a Christian woman's duty. Deprived of most political methods, women began to circulate petitions and did so successly and introduced them into Congress through John Quincy Adams, former president, now congressman from Massachusetts, so much so that the House voted a gag rule that anti-slavery petition, anything about slavery was not to be discussed in the House of Representatives. This is obviously a violation of free speech and representative government. So as women participated very intensely in the abolitionist movement, they became very aware that they were missing something very important, namely the vote. That they were in the same situation as slaves from one point of view, obviously not in terms of the deeper wrongness of slavery. But a number of them began to realize that that there was something they didn't have. And the voice that helped them understand this was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I'm not going to be able to spend too much more time on this, except to say that she was the crossover from the tradition of moral activism based on a religious mission to into a more political process. She could express complicated ideas in accessible language. And she led off in the 1850s with a new magazine called Lily, another one called Una, and she wanted to reject the mysterious twaddle about gender differences, women's fear, and the mission of women. And she's the instigator, with 3 others, of the Seneca Falls Women's Rights meeting of 1848, and she's the author of what became known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which kind of drew up a critique of all the disabilities women had. They weren't allowed into the church leadership, they weren't allowed into universities, and of course they didn't have the vote. And this was a definite no-no for women to demand the equality of vote and participation in politics. And all through the 50s, you got a very rapid, you got a very intense conversation, public conversation, and there's not time to go through, but women were writing. Women were beginning to question the domestic ideology. I want to focus in the time remaining on 2